Chapter 13. Joe hurled off his blanket and sprang out of bed. He searched beneath the bed and found his sword, quiver, and bow. He slung on his bow and quiver, then buckled on his sword belt while he ran. He hadn't had time to think. He was only reacting. Where should he go? He could run to the plateau to join up with his company, but that was too far away, and he hoped they wouldn't even be there now. He didn't even know where the hospital was, where he was. Screams punctuated the sounds of confusion and terror that surrounded him. He ran into the hall and saw a nurse bending over a slain soldier. Her shocked face featured wide, unblinking eyes. The wolves had been here, just outside the hospital. More urgent cries came to his ears, with desperate screams just ahead. He didn't know where he was, but he could hear, and he ran toward the screaming. Joe ran through a doorway with a shout, fear becoming fuel for his wild charge. He passed bucks and does on the ground, killed or wounded by the rampaging pack. He ran through a long corridor, then took several turns that left him standing once more in front of what he thought of as the hospital gate. Emma was there, trying to help make order of the frightening scene. She was shouting commands and tending the wounded nearby. Warning that more wounded would be coming soon, she ordered some dazed does to prep the surgery. A horn sounded loud and shrill, and Joe ran from the hospital entrance, terrified but eager to find the battle. Just as he stepped into the hallway, 5 wolves filled it and charged toward him. He drew his sword and stepped back into the hospital gate, crouching in a defensive position. Joe knew he couldn't hold the gate against 5 wolves, but he was determined to die trying. He glanced back at Emma and said, "They're coming!" He saw her eyes go wide, then he turned back to face the fury of the assault. The wolves came then and rushed by the gate in a blur, bypassing the hospital to head back the way they had come. Joe was startled and, for a moment, couldn't speak. He turned to see Emma at his side. She had taken up a cast-down sword and was standing guard with him. "They're retreating," she said, gasping. "Where are they headed?" Joe asked, peeking back out of the large opening. "You can't leave us here," she said. "Help me defend this place. They'll be bringing so many wounded here. I need help." Joe was going to agree, but just then a series of shrieks resounded in the hallway. "I have to go," he said. She nodded. "Go." Joe left the room with a leap and slid sideways on the stone floor before finding his feet and rushing ahead. More horrible screams filled the hallway, and he sped on, following the sound. He came upon one dreadful scene after another, but he kept charging on with a fierce determination to stop the creatures responsible. He had to find those wolves and take the fight to them. Fear had given way to anger, and he ran on with a desperate desire to reach the enemy. Soon he was joined by other bucks from every citadel. Beside him ran a soldier from Vandalia, the blue and gold banner bright on his chest. They ran on together, though Joe let the other lead, since he clearly knew the way better. "This way!" the Vandalia soldier shouted, and they broke through the door to the savory den, sending chairs flying as they crashed through on the trail of the escaping pack. Joe saw how devastating this first line of the attack had been. The wolves had done great damage here as they entered the secret opening to Cloud Mountain. "Medics!" Gort was shouting. "Send for medics!" A buck peeled off from Joe's ragtag band and hurried back to the hospital. The rest charged on. At last they came to the foggy mouth of the cave and dashed through the trickling spillover and out into a chaotic scene of blood and smoke and desperate cries. Joe spotted Captain Fry 50 yards away, battling with a wolf. Smoke obscured the fight, but Fry was not alone. Joe sprinted ahead while the wolf sent a spear at Captain Fry's middle. Fry dodged and brought his sword down in a massive overhead slice. The wolf deftly sidestepped the strike and lunged at Fry with its jaws wide, snapping into the captain's arm. Joe closed the distance, driving his sword into the wolf. 2 other bucks, Owen and Nate, joined him in killing the wolf, but Captain Fry's arm had been mauled cruelly. The old captain got to his feet slowly, ignoring the awful wound as he cursed. Lieutenant Drand found him, and they conferred quickly. Nate, Joe, and Owen checked on the nearby wounded and gathered arrows from the battle, slipping them into their quivers.
"The Long Treaders are behind this,"
Owen growled.
"I have no doubt."
They arrive, then key leaders of every citadel gather in one place, and that place is immediately attacked, Nate said. It was them all right. Owen spat. Curse the Long Treaders! Joe was furious at the Long Treaders, who had so plainly betrayed them, and at the wolves, who had accomplished such a devastating strike. He wanted to act. What now, sir? He asked, interrupting Fry's conference with Drand. Drand nodded to Fry and hurried back into the cave. We pursue, Captain Fry said, pointing. We'll head southeast over the mountainside, then veer west toward Decca's Landing and their garrison. Captain, your arm, Nate asked, frowning at the wound. Of course, Fry answered, his eyes thinning to slits. I'll only slow you down, and I need to rally more fighters here. Go. The 3 archers rushed into the misty forest and plunged down the mountain. There were terrible sounds behind them and before them. They raced on, leaping wide ditches and ducking under bending limbs. Joe tried to stay focused and track the path that Nate set. In a moment, they came to the fort they had been in last night, charging on beneath it. Joe tried to force out the memory of the failure that haunted him. Junder, lying prone beneath the frenzied face of that bloody wolf. And just as that image came into his mind, they crashed into a clearing and saw a band of rabbits being overwhelmed by wolves. Archers, unleash! Nate cried, sending a series of furious arrow volleys at the enemy. Wolves fell by his well-aimed arrows as Joe and Owen let loose from their own bows. The put-upon bucks were soon recovering, driving back the wolves. The remaining wolves fled into the cover of the far side of the clearing and raced away. Nate sped after them, Joe and Owen on his heels. But when they were halfway across the clearing, arrows aimed from the direction of the fleeing wolves flew right at them. Owen went down, an arrow piercing his leg. Nate and Joe stood over him, returning fire as other rabbits came and dragged Owen away. The situation was reversing quickly, and the wolves came tearing back into the open once more, reinforced by more of their frantic pack. Pull back, Nate called, trying to rally the remaining bucks, many of whom were archers, back to his position. Rally on me! Joe kept shooting, even as arrows grazed his face and arms, and the furious pack charged ahead. Brave bucks met the charge, and the scene descended into a chaotic struggle between the overmatched rabbits and the brutal wolf assault. Nate finally dropped his bow, 7 unspent arrows in his quiver, and drew his sword to deflect the death-dealing strike of an enemy pike. The pike split, and the frenzied wolf hit Nate hard with a broken half. Nate crumbled to the ground. Joe swung his blade at the wolf, but it dodged away and struck out at a Blackstone soldier. Joe was desperate to help Nate, who wasn't moving, but he felt a presence behind him. He turned in time to see a leaping wolf snapping at his head. Joe jerked away just enough and saw the slavering jaws close on his shoulder, sending a piercing pain through his body. As Joe went down, the wolf's short blade raked across his side, tearing a new wound that added to his agony. Joe fell, and the wolf moved on to strike the next nearest rabbit. More pursuing rabbits poured into the clearing, and Joe's attacker was laid low by a perfectly aimed arrow. He turned to see who his savior had been, but saw the Harbone archer fall just at that moment. Joe was bleeding badly, stretched out and barely able to move. He watched helplessly as the wolves overcame the small band of rabbits, and he saw every archer fall in turn. Nate was down, both he and Owen lying motionless nearby. Other archers, from every citadel, their bows broken and arrows scattered on the ground, lay still beside their half-wind comrades. The clearing, which had so recently been a scene of brutal battle, now fell eerily silent. Joe could hear the faint clamor of battle from down the mountain as, gritting his teeth, he checked his wounds. Joe was no medic, but he knew they were very bad. Struggling to his feet, he tried to pursue the fight, but he was confused. He stumbled away from the horrible scene, not really knowing where he was going. He staggered painfully, step by slow step, until he could go no farther. He leaned against a tree, trying to regain his balance and focus. Soon, he sagged to the ground. His pain subsided, and his mind felt thick. He found it hard to focus. He noticed the leaves on the trees. The forest blurred as one leaf seemed to swell, suddenly plain to Joe in all its tiny details. He smiled, feeling himself beginning to slip down in his mind. He was falling down, down. He was losing his hold on the world as the forest and its astonishing leaves began to slip from his attention. It was replaced by images of his father shaking his head, of Captain Fry, Lieutenant Drand, Nate Flynn, and a host of other notables, all shaking their heads in disappointment at him. The images became blurry, even in his mind. He blinked and saw them all better, but could not remember why they were there, and soon he didn't even know who they were. Before things went black, he no longer cared. Chapter 14. Waking at the sound of heavy footfalls, Joe blinked his eyes open and saw a white doe leap over a fallen log, then skid to a stop. She spun, face twisted in indecision. Then he recognized her. Heather Longtreader? His attention sharpened with a sudden surge of anger. She ran toward him, glancing back down the mountain, and then back at Joe. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'll make it," Joe answered gruffly. She hesitated a moment, then ran over, examining his wounds before carefully rolling him over and helping him rest his head against the tree. She went to work, tearing some cloth loose and bandaging his wounds. Joe wavered between joy at being helped and anger at who was kneeling in front of him. He began to lose the scene and all meaning again. "Help!" she cried out, long and desperate. But he was falling again, losing himself. "Wounded, here!" The forest disappeared in an avalanche of black. "Stay with me," he heard her say, but it was as if she was calling to him from across a lake. She disappeared for a moment, then was there again, shaking his face. "What's your name?" she asked. "Joe Shanks," he said, his attention returning, and with it the familiar anger. "Okay, Joe, you have to hang on, all right? Help is coming. My name's Heather, and I've stopped the bleeding. You'll be okay, just sit tight." "Why are you helping me?" Joe asked, voice hoarse. "You're a Longtreader. The wolves. You betrayed us." "No, sir," Heather answered, bending to kiss his cheek, like an older sister might for a younger sibling. "Never, but I must leave you now, Joe, and I'm sorry for that, but be strong. Today we strike a blow against our foes." It was impossible to doubt her sincerity. How could this be? Joe's mind was struggling with the complexity of a world where a Longtreader could be a friend, not a foe. "Wounded here! Help!" Heather Longtreader called again. Then, with one last compassionate glance at Joe, she tore off down the mountain. Joe was alone again, still wounded, though Heather Longtreader had said she stopped the bleeding, and her words gave him hope. If it was true, and it seemed everyone would soon know if it was true, then it was possible that the secret citadels could unite against Morbin. Rabbit-kind could work together for the cause of the Mended Wood. Heather Longtreader could even be a key to how that might come about. Looking down at his well-tended wounds, Joe found it impossible to believe that a young doe would dash into danger, stop to help a half-wind soldier, and continue her selfless charge down the mountain if she were in league with Morbin. Reeling, Joe tried to sit up. He felt a sharp pang of guilt at how he and his fellows had treated the Longtreaders. What if they were all loyal, as Lord Rake had always said? What if Garton really had acted alone? Garton Longtreader was far away, in the Prey Lord's High Bleak's stronghold. Wilfred was here. His niece and nephew were here. Joe felt lightheaded, but he focused all his energy and tried to stand. He tottered and, leaning against the tree, was able to find his balance again. He knew getting back to Captain Fry and the savory den was impossible, but his friends were nearby, hurt or worse. If they were still alive, he had a duty to help them. He was desperate to help them. Joe struggled forward, resting every 5 or 10 steps against a tree, then walking on, slowly making his way to the clearing where Nate and Owen had fallen. It was an awful sight, but he scanned the field for his friends. So many soldiers down, and broken bows scattered on the ground. Not all the bows were broken, however, and arrows were everywhere. Hanging the best bow he could find over his neck and shoulder, he gathered up as many nearby arrows as he could and filled his quiver. "I have to find Nate and Owen." He heard a low moan nearby, and he swiveled to see a soldier wincing in pain, lying on his back. Joe slowly made his way over and saw by the buck's blood-stained tunic that he was from the forest guard of Cloud Mountain. The wounded rabbit had a quiver of arrows at his side. An archer, then. "It's going to be okay, soldier," Joe said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He knelt beside him with a grimace. "Help's on the way. I just came from up the mountain. The medics are coming." This was a little more optimistic than honest, but it wasn't a lie. They had to be sending help. The medics would be coming soon. "I won't make it," the soldier said. "I won't ever see the mended wood." "Hey," Joe said, chiding in his best schoolmaster tone. "I just got word that we're reversing this whole attack. Today we strike a blow against our enemies." "I hope that's true." The soldier smiled weakly, while Joe tried, weak as he was, to bind his wounds. His hands were shaking, but he did the best he could. The soldier fell silent, and Joe, with a long sigh, settled down to rest a moment. But there would be no rest. A band of wolves entered the far edge of the wide clearing, their wild eyes frantically scanning the scene for fresh prey. They hadn't seen Joe yet. Then Heather Longtreader broke into the clearing, sprinting up the mountain. Chapter 15. Heather couldn't see the wolves. She was splitting the center of the wide clearing, and they were on the far side, just emerging from the forest. Joe's heart sank. 5 fresh wolves against 1 doe who was unaware of their presence, and 2 half-dead bucks on the other side of the clearing. Joe glanced at the Cloud Mountain archer. He wasn't moving. 1 buck, then. 1 buck, 1 bow, 1 quiver. Joe was the last archer. The wolves saw her, and the first 4 snapped into action, tearing after her. The last wolf readied his bow, but found that his quiver was empty. The wolf archer began to search the ground nearby for an arrow. Heather kept her gaze ahead, and Joe noticed that her arm was bound by a makeshift sling. She was already hurt. Joe did not know why, but he felt in that moment it was absolutely essential that she be protected. He felt it with a sudden urgent certainty that seemed to surge up from deep inside. He had no choice but to act. The wolves came in a frenzy as Joe rose, inhaling as he did. He knocked his first arrow and blew out a ragged breath as he fired. The arrow caught the foremost wolf on the shoulder, and it went down, howling in agony. It scampered off as Heather sped on. The second wolf fell by Joe's more steady shot, never to rise again. Joe's confidence rose, though he could feel with intensifying pain that the binding on his wounds had unraveled, and he was bleeding freely again. No time for that. He knocked his next 2 arrows at once, aiming carefully as the ravenous pair surged, desperately close to Heather's heels. He breathed out, ignoring the tearing pain in his side and shoulder, and fired his brace of arrows. The 3rd and 4th wolves fell with mournful howls. Agonizing pain coursed through his side, and his shoulder felt on fire. Still, he knocked another arrow, this time raising it to trace the last enemy. The archer wolf had found his arrow. When Joe raised his bow, the wolf released his own arrow, aimed right at Heather. It seemed to happen in slow motion. Heather, rushing up the mountain. Joe, raising his bow as he saw the wolf aim his. Too late. The wolf's arrow racing toward Heather's unprotected back. Joe didn't have time to think. He snapped his arm along the darting path of the arrow and fired his own with a force and concentration he had never yet used. His arrow burst forward, aimed not for the wolf archer, but ahead of the speeding arrow the wolf had shot. Joe tracked the path of his desperate shot as it sped through the air between the wolf and Heather. He watched, eyes wide, as his arrow's sharp tip split the center of the wolf's speeding shaft, snapping it in half. Heather dashed into the cover of trees, unharmed. She had escaped, and Joe had accomplished the most incredible bow shot imaginable. The only one who had seen it was the archer wolf, who stood staring across the clearing, uncomprehending. Joe reached for another arrow, and when he raised his arm, saw nothing there. The wolf had retreated into the forest. Joe sagged to the ground, wounds torn open by his extreme effort, and a weight of exhaustion pressing on him. His strength was gone, and the fresh blood flow meant he was in grave danger once again. He closed his eyes and settled onto the ground, fading into a half-dream. No disapproving voices haunted his vision, nor were any angry faces shaking their heads at his shame. Joe believed he was dying, but a weary smile played across his face. Chapter 16. Joe Shanks awoke in the Cloud Mountain Hospital again. After surgery, he had been nursed through days of weakness and fever that left him feeling sluggish and confused. He had dreamt, but not of disheartening failures or impeded glories. He saw no vision of his father or Captain Fry looking down on him in disappointment. When he opened his eyes, fully awake at last, Captain Fry was looking down on him. The surly old soldier was clearly making his rounds to see the half-win wounded, though he was badly wounded himself. His arm was fitted with bandages and bound to his body by an elaborate wrap. Fry was flanked by Lieutenant Drand and Nate Flynn. All of them looked battered, but reasonably well, considering what had occurred. Seeing Nate, tears started in Joe's eyes. They had survived the first battle of the war. "Back in bed, Joe?" Nate asked. "Back in the hospital? You're no sage, that's for sure." "Owen?" Joe asked, voice hoarse. "Alive," Nate answered. Joe smiled and let out a relieved breath. "Shanks," Captain Fry said, "it's good to see you awake. We were concerned." Joe sat up, too quickly he found, as his shoulder erupted in agony and his head swam. He managed a wincing salute as Captain Fry scowled. "Lay still, soldier," he said. "You nearly had your arm torn off." Joe nodded, the battle playing out in his mind in vivid detail. "We found you in the clearing after the battle," Lieutenant Drand said. "It looked like a horrific struggle." "I got knocked out, Joe," Nate said. "I don't remember much." "Reports of what happened in the clearing are sketchy," Drand said. "Did you see much?" Joe remembered everything. He had been a hero. He had saved Heather Longtreader with a shot he would never have believed could happen unless he had seen it himself, done it himself. Here was an opportunity for glory, unlike anything his father could have ever dreamed of for Joe. "What happened out there, soldier?" Captain Fry asked. "Nothing much, sir," Joe answered, glancing down at his carefully bandaged wounds. "We were engaged with the enemy, and I was hurt in the battle." Captain Fry stared at him a long moment, then nodded. Then he and the other officers moved on to the next wounded soldier. A few minutes later, Emma came in, a wide smile on her face. "Awake at last," she said, feeling his head. "No fever." She listened to his heart and asked him to breathe deeply. "Stronger. Very good indeed." "Thank you for saving me," Joe said. Emma smiled at him and then dug into her bag. "I brought you something to read." "What is it?" "It's a book that's setting the whole of Cloud Mountain on fire," she said, beaming with excitement. "Copies are being made and the scribes can't keep up. It's going to inspire the cause all over Natalia." He took the little book in his hands. "Who wrote this?" "Heather Longtreader," Emma said, then added with pride, "My very best friend." "Heather Longtreader?" he asked, gasping. "Yes," Emma answered, beaming. "The Longtreaders saved Prince Jupiter Smalls." "Smalls? The prince?" "Yes, that little white rabbit is Jupiter's heir. Everyone is talking about him, Prince Jupiter Smalls." "I'm amazed," Joe said. "And this is Heather Longtreader's story?" "Yes, it tells what Pickett Longtreader did. Joe, he flew. The book says it all. But one problem is that it doesn't say much about how brave Heather was. She rallied the soldiers to save the prince after Pickett rescued him. I'm amazed she survived at all. She was right in the thick of it. I don't know how she made it." Joe smiled, tears starting in his eyes. He wiped them away and began to read. The end. This has been The Last Archer, a Green Ember story by S.D. Smith. This book was narrated by Eric Fritzius. For more from the Green Ember series and author S.D. Smith, visit sdsmith.net. And now, a note from the author.
Hello, this is S.D. Smith. I hope you enjoyed listening to The Last Archer, a Green Ember story, as much as I enjoyed writing it. Writing is very hard work, but while I work, I love to imagine you reading or listening and enjoying a new adventure. That keeps me going. That and chocolate, of course. I have so much respect for you as a reader and as a listener. I hope that shows. The time I spend creating stories in the Forge is well spent if it means you receive the gift of a little bit of light and joy and hope. I believe in the power of stories. I believe that when they hint at a rebuke to the darkness, when they whisper to us that a hero may rise to set things right, they tell the truth. So, in a way, these stories are true. My friend Heidi Johnston says that the best stories are not an escape from reality, but an escape into reality. I believe that, and because I believe it, I made this for you. God bless you and keep you. Your friend, Sam.